What's up, guys? Nick Whalen here from RotoWire, back with another video. This time we're talking about a handful of players who I'm growing concerned about in fantasy football as we head into week 5 of the NFL season. Let's get right into it, and we start with the New York Jets. I think there's a case for both Breece Hall and Garret Wilson to wind up on this list. Breece Hall, of course, coming off a disaster game last week against Denver. I think Breece Hall is going to be fine. I'm not backing off of that one, but I have some concerns about Garret Wilson. He's basically doing the same thing every single week, and that is not a good thing. He's been a very mediocre fantasy receiver so far. You dig in on the target volume, it's been okay. He's seen about 25% of Aaron Rodgers' targets, which is fine, but not elite. He was right around 30% of team targets a year ago, but the Jets are well below league average in terms of yards per attempt. It's still, relatively low volume passing game. Wilson is averaging just 9.6 yards per reception so far this season. He was at 13.3 as a rookie, 11 yards per reception last season. He's 87th in the NFL in yards before contact per reception as well. And the overall quality of those targets, it hasn't really increased nearly as much as we thought it would with Aaron Rodgers taking over at quarterback. Wilson is catching only about 59% of his targets so far, compared to 57% a year ago with Zach Wilson. Just 3 receptions of more than 15 yards so far on the season. Consider that someone like Nico Collins, for instance, had 17 plays of 15 plus yards. And yeah, Nico Collins is an outlier. He's leading the league by a mile, but still, almost every other elite wide receiver one in the NFL has at least 7 or 8 15 plus yard plays. Again, Garret Wilson, just 3 of those so far. He only has 1 touchdown on the year, so he's not making up for the lack of yardage with touchdown production. Kind of thought he might be the new Davante Adams for Aaron Rodgers in that regard, where they're inside the 5 and Rodgers is kind of padding those touchdown stats. Just hasn't been the case. And the Jets, for their part, they only have 10 red zone trips on the year through 4 games. Hard to fathom that Garret Wilson was somehow a significantly better fantasy receiver with Zach Wilson than he's been so far with Aaron Rodgers. I will say, though, in defense of Wilson, he's faced some really tough matchups. The Niners in week 1, L'Jarius Sneed with the Titans in week 2, Christian Gonzalez with the Pats in week 3, and maybe the best of them all in Pat Surtain and the Broncos in week 4. Sloppy game. Not going to see a lot of passing there. But the Jets have a tough stretch of matchups coming up here. It doesn't get a whole lot easier. Got to go to London this week to face the best defense in football in the Minnesota Vikings. You got Buffalo, Pittsburgh, New England again, Houston coming up. Yes, I'm including the Pats in there. That was not a overly productive game for either Hall or Garret Wilson back in week 3. And the last thing when it comes to Garret Wilson, we have to consider the very real possibility that the Jets trade for Davante Adams, bringing in another elite receiver to this offense. And yeah, you can make the argument that maybe that frees things up a bit for Garret Wilson, but overall, that's a net negative. You don't want to bring in Aaron Rodgers' favorite target throughout his career to this team. That's going to siphon a lot of those targets, a lot of that usage away from Garret Wilson. So it's not a done deal, but it's a likelihood, in my opinion, that the New York Jets are going to try to get that deal done for Davante Adams. I don't think that'd be good news for Garret Wilson. Next on our list, we're going to Carolina, Chuba Hubbard. And look, I love Chuba Hubbard. I have an embarrassing amount of Chuba Hubbard shares this season, and I'm going to keep riding him as long as I can. But we always knew this could be a limited run. I think when you invested in Chuba Hubbard, there's a reason he was available as late as he was in drafts. The Panthers are eventually going to activate Jonathan Brooks, their rookie out of Texas, in the coming weeks. He's going to have a role in that backfield. Maybe it's not a huge one right away, but at some point, Jonathan Brooks is going to have a significant cut of that workload. And there's also the possibility that Bryce Young could potentially reclaim this job at some point. And that would not be good for anybody involved, especially Chuba Hubbard and especially Deontay Johnson. We'll see how long Carolina is willing to ride Dalton. Obviously, it's gone very well through 2 weeks. Maybe it is the rest of the season. Who knows? But I think the original idea is that Young would sit for a while. He'd take some of the pressure off him, see some reps, and eventually get another shot at this job later in the year. Ultimately, we have to keep in mind this is a team that's still very much in developmental mode. They want to see what they have in Brooks. They know Dalton is not the long-term solution. You look at the last 2 weeks for Chuba Hubbard, fantastic production, 28 and 22 fantasy points. But those did come against 2 of the best fantasy matchups in the NFL right now in the Vegas and Cincinnati defenses. Schedule, by default, it's got to stiffen up for the Panthers going forward. The Bears this week, that's a really tough matchup in Chicago. The Falcons the week after, a good Broncos defense later in October. That's been a really, really good unit so far. If you have Chuba Hubbard, enjoy it while it lasts. Ride it out if you can. But I may consider selling high on Chuba in some of my leagues. Before we get to the rest of our list, please give this video a like if you're enjoying it, and make sure, of course, that you're subscribed to the RotoWire YouTube channel. We're going to continue to bring you a ton of NFL content through the rest of the season. All right, next up on our list, we're going to Kansas City. We got to talk about Patrick Mahomes. Look, man, the Chiefs may be 4-0. They've won 10 in a row dating back to last season. They've won 2 consecutive Super Bowls. They're doing just fine, but we have to be a little concerned with Patrick Mahomes' fantasy upside going forward. Through 4 games, he's put up 15, 16, and 13 fantasy points. He just lost his best, highest volume receiver by far in Rashee Rice. We'll see if Rice misses the rest of the season or not. Either way, he's going to miss a big chunk of time. Hollywood Brown, if he comes back, it's probably not until the playoffs. And maybe the Chiefs make a move at the deadline, but we'll see if that's anybody who's a real difference maker. I'm not optimistic. KC is simply a middle-of-the-road offense until proven otherwise. It looks a lot like it did last season. They're 16th in EPA. They're 15th in yards per play. They're 10th in net yards per attempt. Mahomes has just 6 touchdowns and 5 picks on the year. He ranks 19th in the NFL in passer rating. KC, much like a year ago, is struggling to generate explosive plays down the field. They have just 10 plays of 20-plus yards on the season, passing or rushing. That ranks in the bottom half of the National Football League. I'm not sure it's going to get better anytime soon. KC could keep winning games ugly. They've proven that. They can win any which way. We've seen different variations of this Chiefs team over the years, and they've all been extremely successful. Mahomes is going to continue to be an excellent real-life quarterback, but the dream of him returning to being this 5,000-yard passer who throws for 47 touchdowns, it's not looking good so far. He's down to 226 yards per game so far this season, far and away the lowest number of his career. If you invested an early pick in Patrick Mahomes, it's not looking like that's going to pay off. Next up, we go to a running back, Rhmandre Stevenson of the New England Patriots. And look, I put him on the list earlier this week. This was before Gerard Mayo came out and said Wednesday that starting Antonio Gibson over Stevenson is, quote, definitely under consideration for week 5 against the Miami Dolphins. Not good. That is not good. We'll see what kind of role Stevenson has this weekend, but either way, things have been trending in the wrong direction for him after a solid first 2 weeks of the season. Stevenson, of course, had the infamous 0.3 fantasy point game against the Jets on Thursday night in week 3, followed it up with just 8.2 fantasy points last week against the Niners. He's fumbled in all 4 games so far. A couple of those have been very costly. And frankly, for as good as Stevenson can be and proven that he's been over the last couple of years, Antonio Gibson has been the big play creator in that backfield so far. New England is not getting any of that. No big plays in the passing game. They need to find ways to generate those chunk plays. And so far, Antonio Gibson has been the better bet. Fumble and workload issues aside, the Pats do have a very tough schedule coming up, loaded with good run defenses. The Dolphins, the Texans, the Jags, the Jets, the Titans, the Bears. Yes, even the Jags do have a solid run defense. That's the one thing they can hang their hat on. We're in full panic mode right now with Rhmandre Stevenson, especially if we see Antonio Gibson take on the lion's share of the carries this weekend. All right, 2 more players I want to hit. The first of those, another running back, Carson Steele of the Kansas City Chiefs. And we're well beyond worried when it comes to Steele. We might even be beyond panic here. The Chiefs might just be done with Carson Steele at this point. He lost a key fumble against Cincy in week 2. He lost another fumble on the first drive of the game against the Chargers last week. Saw a few snaps the rest of the way, but I think he's firmly in Andy Reid's doghouse right now. In Kansas City, keep in mind, they have 2 capable backs right now in Kareem Hunt and Samaje Perine, 2 veterans that they trust. They'll be getting Clyde Edwards-Helaire back, perhaps as soon as this week against the Saints. I think they're more than comfortable riding that trio going forward. And keep in mind that Isaiah Pacheco did not suffer a season-ending injury. I mean, he could be back in a month from now, depending on how that fibula heals. If you spent a good chunk of fab on Carson Steele 2 weeks ago, you might just be taking an L on that. I think we got to be realistic. The Chiefs gave him his chances. He had his opportunities. But the way this offense is operating right now, they cannot afford to be turning the ball over on the ground. All right, the last player on our list, you kind of knew he was going to be featured here, right? Kyle Pitts. It feels like we're going down that same road again, aren't we? Pitts took a 0 in week 4 against the New Orleans Saints. He's given you 12.9 total fantasy points over the last 3 games. Somehow he's still a top 20 tight end on the year, which really says more about the overall tight end landscape than Kyle Pitts himself. But through 4 games, he only has 15 total targets. He got that bailout touchdown in week 1. That's really all we have to cling to right now as Kyle Pitts fantasy managers. This time last year, when we were in full-on disaster mode with Kyle Pitts, he had 21 targets through 4 games. It's somehow worse now than it was under Arthur Smith. And look, maybe the Falcons passing game coalesces as the year goes along. I don't know, but we're seeing an alarming amount of short throws. We're seeing a lot of throws behind the line of scrimmage, a lot of Ray McCloud, a lot of Darnell Mooney so far. Entering week 5, Pitts ranks 5th on his own team in targets from Kirk Cousins. Falcons are also a slow-paced team. They've run the 2nd fewest plays in the NFL. They struggle to convert 3rd downs. They're not really giving Kyle Pitts any opportunities to make plays downfield. And look, at this point, it's clearly not just a Falcons problem. This has spanned 2 coaching regimes. It's a Kyle Pitts problem. He ranks last among qualified tight ends in average separation rate, according to NFL Next Gen Stats. Kirk Cousins isn't looking his way, but that's because he's not getting open. And, going forward, Pitts will still have his occasional splashes. He'll snag a touchdown here and there. We're going to talk ourselves back into this a few times, but the idea of him kind of re-breaking out and looking like the guy that he was as a rookie, I think that ship has sailed. All right, those are the players I am panicking about as we head into week 5 of the NFL season. Did I miss anybody? Who are you panicking about on your teams? Let us know in the comments below. We always love hearing from you guys. Please, again, make sure you're subscribed to the RotoWire YouTube channel.